Welcome to the final video in Module 2. Over the past videos, we examined macro, meso, and micro policy and governance separately. We also explored the role of culture and shadow policies in shaping educational systems. Now it is time to bring these pieces back together. One of the central ideas of HEPGA is that educational policy and governance cannot be fully understood by examining a single level in isolation. As shown in the center of the slide, macro, meso, and micro levels constantly interact with one another. Policy and governance move in multiple directions rather than following a simple top-down process. The left side of the slide illustrates how influence often flows downward. Governments establish policies, legislation, funding models, and priorities at the macro level. Organizations interpret these priorities and make decisions at the meso level. Educators and other actors then experience and enact these decisions at the micro level. But we also know that influence also flows upward. Classroom experiences, local innovations, emerging challenges, and community concerns often shape organizational responses. Over time, these responses can influence broader policy discussions, reforms, and system-wide priorities. This means that educational issues rarely belong to one level. A challenge that appears in a classroom may be connected to organizational decisions, resource allocation, leadership practices, or even government priorities. Similarly, a policy developed at the macro level may be reshaped as it moves through organizations and into practice. HEPGA encourages us to think relationally. Instead of asking which level is responsible, we ask, how do these levels interact to produce this outcome? It's time to pause and discuss. Think about a challenge, opportunity, or policy issue in your own educational context. It could relate to inclusion, assessment, technology, student well-being, staffing, curriculum, or any other issue that affects your work. How do macro, meso, and micro factors interact to shape that issue? Where do you see influences flowing downward? Where do you see influences flowing upward? You can pause the video and discuss. When you're ready, continue to the next video, where we will explore how culture and shadow policies interact with these levels and further shape educational systems. In the previous slide, we explored how macro, meso, and micro levels interact with one another. However, HEPGA reminds us that educational systems are influenced by more than formal structures and policies. Culture and shadow policy also shape how decisions are made across all levels of the system. The left side of the slide represents the visible system. These are the formal elements that are often easiest to identify: policies, structures, and procedures. They tell us how the system is intended to function. The right side of the slide represents what is often less visible but equally influential. Relationships, norms, and informal practices shape how people interpret policies, respond to challenges, and make decisions in everyday situations. Notice that culture and shadow policy sit in the center of the diagram rather than at a particular level, and this is intentional. They operate across macro, meso, and micro levels simultaneously. They influence governments and policy makers, organizational leaders and institutions, and educators, students, and communities. This means that two organizations operating under the same policy may produce very different outcomes because their cultures, relationships, and informal practices differ. One of the strengths of HEPGA is that it encourages us to look beyond formal structures and ask deeper questions about what is happening beneath the surface. We ask questions like, who influences decisions informally? What norms guide behavior? What unwritten rules shape practice? At this point, you can pause the video and reflect. You can think about your own educational context, and you can ask questions such as, when important decisions are made, what tends to have the greatest influence? Formal policies and procedures or informal norms, relationships, and expectations? Can you think of an example where culture of an unwritten rule influenced a decision more strongly than a formal policy? HEPGA is more than a framework for identifying different levels of policy and governance. It is a way of understanding how these levels interact within a broader educational system. At the center of the slide are educational outcomes. Whether we are examining student learning, inclusion, equity, well-being, organizational effectiveness, or policy implementation, outcomes emerge from the interaction of multiple factors rather than a single policy or decision. Surrounding these outcomes are the macro, meso, and micro levels. As we've discussed throughout this module, these levels continuously influence one another. At the same time, culture and shadow policy operate across all levels of the system. They influence how people interpret policies, how decisions are made, and how actions are carried out in practice. One of the key insights of HEPGA is that educational outcomes are rarely the result of a single cause. Instead, they emerge from the interaction of formal structures, informal influences, organizational processes, and everyday practice. This is why HEPGA encourages us to move beyond simple explanations. When we encounter a challenge, the question is not simply which policy caused this. Instead, we ask, how are macro, meso, and micro factors interacting? How is culture influencing decision making? What role are shadow policies and informal practices playing? You can pause the video here and think about a challenge or opportunity in your educational context. Using HEPGA, how might you analyze that issue differently than before? What macro, meso, or micro factors are involved? What cultural influences or shadow policies might be shaping outcomes? And what important connections might be overlooked if you focus on only one level of the system? You can pause the video and discuss.